I just finished reading the Marcel Proust book, Remembrance of Things Past, and I wanted to explore one scene in this book. 3 volumes that took many years for Marcel Proust to write. And what I'm going to do is describe one scene, and the reason why I chose this scene is because it involves a painting. And I think it's wonderful the way that Marcel Proust wove the description of this painting into the book. And also I think it's interesting to look at a painting that Marcel Proust looked at. Now, as anyone who read Proust know, he can be very wordy and detailed. So this scene in the book is very detailed. We're going to go over it several times to go over all the details. So you're going to see what Proust is doing. Maybe people who haven't read the book can get an idea of if they think it's worthwhile to read Proust. Now, the narrator of the book was in love with a woman named Albertine, and it takes up a good part of the book. He goes over his relationship with Albertine in great detail. In fact, the first time I read it, I was sick of Albertine because he just was so obsessed with it. Now, this is the second time I've read the book, and I enjoyed more of the details this time because I knew what was happening. Now, in this scene, the narrator has separated from Albertine, and he has gone to Venice to look at the paintings in Venice and to try to forget Albertine. He wants to get her out of his system. He says he's not in love with her. It's about 5 sentences that we're going to go through, and we're going to examine it very, very closely. In the book, which I first read in 1991, and now I finished again in 2018. This time I enjoyed it even more than I did the first time. It's a difficult book to read because of the long sentences and all of the details and all the words you don't know. I had to make a decision, when you come up along all these references that Proust has and you don't know them, you're going to spend time looking at each reference and each sentence and studying it up just so that sentence can mean something? Or are you going to kind of roll over it and use your imagination to guess what that means? Or are you just going to ignore it and try to stick with the storyline of try to describe with the general idea of the book? It's a decision that every reader has to make. There's a lot of large words that I had to look up. There's many foreign words, foreign expressions in the book. So you have to, in order to understand everything, I would really be amazed if anybody could read this book and not have to look up something in a dictionary or, today with the internet, you can look up things much, much more easily than you could in the past. Because you might have, in this example, there's a painting described in the book, and you would have had to, 20 years ago, you would have had to go to the library, find a book on this Italian painter, and he's not obscure, but he's fairly unknown in the United States, and his name is Vittorio Carpaccio. Now, you would have had to make all that effort just to read one sentence in one scene. I mean, I would probably blow that off and not take the time to do that, and I imagine most people would. With today's internet, you can study all these things and look them up, and it's really exciting the way you can read Proust these days with all the reference material that's available to you. So let's just go over the first basic outline of what he's saying. So this is from the book called The Fugitive. Carpaccio, as it happens, who was the painter we visited most readily when I was not working in St. Mark's, almost succeeded one day in reviving my love of Albertine. I was seeing for the first time the patriarch of Grado exercising a demonic. I looked at the marvelous rose pink and violet sky and the tall encrusted chimneys silhouetted against it, their flared stacks blossoming like red tulips, reminiscent of so many whistlers of Venice. Then my eyes traveled from the old wooden Rialto to that 15th century Ponte Vecchio and its marble palaces decorated with gilded capitals, and return to the canal in which the boats are maneuvered by adolescents in pink jackets and plumed torques. Finally, before leaving the picture, my eyes came back to the shore, swarming with everyday Venetian life of the period. I looked at the barber wiping his razor, at the Negro humping his barrel, at the Muslims conversing, at the noblemen in wide-sleeved brocade and damask robes and hats of cerise velvet, and suddenly I felt a slight gnawing at my heart. On the back of one of the Compagni della Calza, identifiable from the emblem embroidered in gold and pearls on their sleeves or their collars of the merry confraternity to which they were affiliate, I had just recognized the cloak which Albertine had put on to come with me to Versailles in an open carriage on the evening when I so little suspected that scarcely 15 hours separated me from the moment of her departure from my house. Always ready for anything, when I had asked her to come out with me on that melancholy evening which she was to describe in her last letter as doubly crepuscular in that dusk was falling and we were about to part. She had flung over her shoulders a Fortuny cloak which she had taken away with her the next day, which I never thought of since. It was from this Carpaccio picture that inspired son of Venice had taken it. It was from the soldiers of this Compagno della Calza that he had removed it in order to drape it over the shoulder of so many Parisian women who were certainly unaware, as I had been until then, that the model for it existed in a group of noblemen in the foreground of the Patriarch of Grado in a room in the Accademia in Venice. I had recognized it down to the last detail, and that cloak having restored to me, as I looked at it, the eyes and the heart of him who had set out that evening with Albertine for Versailles, I was overcome for a few moments by a vague feeling of desire and melancholy. So that is the scene. As I said, he's in the Accademia Museum in Venice, which is one of the great museums to see Venetian art. So we'll start at the beginning. Carpaccio. Vittore Carpaccio was born in Venice. Carpaccio, as it happens, who was the painter we visited most readily when I was not working in St. Mark's. Of course, that's a reference to St. Mark's Square. He almost succeeded one day in reviving my love of Albertine. I was seeing for the first time the Patriarch of Grado exorcising a demonic. This painting is also called The Healing of the Madman, or The Miracle of the Relic of the Cross of the Ponte di Rialto. The Patriarch is a high-level Catholic bishop, and Grado is a town on a peninsula in northern Italy. And this miracle occurs in Venice. The subject of the painting is a miracle that is occurring. The Patriarch of Grado has a piece of wood that is said to be from Christ's cross. The person who holds this cross is able to perform miracles with this piece of wood. So the madman is there, we can see it on this balcony, and he waves the cross over the madman, and the madman becomes sane. Now that's a miracle. That's something that Carpaccio wanted to share with us. This scene is dramatic, and people who would be looking at this painting would probably be looking at that miracle and feel the intensity and the strength of their religion through watching this miracle. There's many other things going on in this painting that Carpaccio captures. And it's interesting that Proust doesn't even mention the miracle. He just talks about the other things. And yet the miracle is the subject of the painting. That's where his mind was. He was really trying to forget Albertine. I looked at the marvelous rose, pink, and violet sky and the tall encrusted chimneys silhouetted against it, their flared stacks blossoming like red tulips, reminiscent of so many whistlers of Venice. Now we see, now I'm working with reproductions that I found on the internet. When I look at the sky, I don't see so much the violet sky. I do see the rose pink and it's kind of blue, but I have to trust what I see in these reproductions. I'm not able to go to Venice and take some good shots of all these things I'm going to present to you. I'm using the best images I have. You can see the flared stacks blossoming like red tulips. And then he says, reminiscent of so many whistlers of Venice. That's a reference to James Whistler, who was an American who lived mainly in England, but he traveled the continent, and he did, I think he did etchings and maybe paintings in Venice. But he was a well-known painter in society circles, certainly around Proust's time, very popular, considered exceptional. So then he says, then my eyes traveled to the old wooden Rialto. You can see the Rialto Bridge here. That is famous because there are stores. Well, it is famous. It was burned. This is the old Rialto. Then they rebuilt it. So it is a famous bridge. It's a covered bridge and it has stores on the inside of the bridge. Then my eyes traveled from the old wooden Rialto to that 15th century Ponte Vecchio with its marble palaces decorated with gilded capitals, comma. We pointed out the Rialto Bridge, but I have to raise the flag of uncertainty here, because then his eyes go to the 15th century Ponte Vecchio. The Ponte Vecchio is a bridge in Florence. We're in Venice. All at once he's traveled to Florence. But then he says, with its marble palaces decorated with gilded capitals. We can see on where the balcony here, where the miracle takes place, we see the gilded capitals. Capitals are the columns. We see the gold on the columns. So it appears he's talking about the activity up here on the balcony. And he's not even looking at the miracle. He's just looking at the gilded capitals. But the problem is, he says Ponte Vecchio, which is a word for old bridge, but that's not a bridge, that's a building. And Ponte Vecchio is in Florence. It's a famous bridge in Florence. So there's some uncertainty here. I can think of three different things going on here. Number one, Proust made an error. He said it was the Ponte Vecchio, it's some other building. Number two, the translator made an error. Or the editor made an error and put in Ponte Vecchio. Or number three, I'm missing something and I've made an error somehow and I don't understand what's going on. But somehow this Ponte Vecchio, which is a capital P and a capital V, meaning it is a specific Ponte Vecchio, which is in Florence. I was interested in the gilded capital, the building of the gilded capital. When I looked at the maps of the Rialto Bridge, and I couldn't determine exactly where it wasn't obvious where this building with the gilded capitals appears. There is some uncertainty at this point, but we just have to move on. Then he says his eyes return to the canal, which the boats are maneuvered by adolescents in pink jackets and plumed torques. To me, the jackets they're wearing are red, scarlet covered, but he calls them pink. Then we also have him saying the plumed torques, which are the hats, plumed meaning they have feathers. Finally, before leaving the picture, my eyes became back to the shore, swarming with the everyday Venetian life of the period. So he's looking below the miracle on the colonnade there, on the walkway there. I looked at the barber wiping his razor. I couldn't find the barber wiping his razor, and this has to do with what my reproductions I have. I looked for him. I thought it might be this, and I couldn't identify that 100% as a barber wiping a razor. This figure of the barber wiping the razor, I'm sure it's there because all these other things are, but I couldn't find it. Then he says, and the Negro humping his barrel. Now, humping is often used in today's society as a vulgar term, but another way to use humping is someone who's moving a big object. here is the man here, and he has the barrel on his side, and he's pouring the water into the canal. And then there's another man with a barrel on his shoulder. So it's either one. I think it's the guy with the water, pouring the water into the canal. That's the Negro humping the barrel. He says, the Muslims conversing. Now, here we have the Muslims conversing, and they're facing the viewer. Then he goes, at the noblemen in wide-sleeved brocade and damask robes and hats of cerise velvet, and suddenly I felt a slight gnawing at my heart. Now we see the nobleman here on the left with the embroidered brocade with wide sleeves. On the back of one of the Compagni della Causa, identifiable from the emblem embroidered in gold and pearls on their sleeves or their collars of the married confraternity to which they were affiliate. We have two figures here. He's referencing here on the back of the Compagni della Causa. Now the Compagni della Causa is a group of entertainers in Venice who wore colorful clothes, and they wore an emblem. So we have two characters. We have this one character on the right. We see his back with a black robe, and he has some very delicate embroidery on there. Then to the left we see another person with the back and curly hair with a velvet hat and some tights, stripes on the left side and red on the right. And I think that's a Compagni della Causa. I also think this character with the back to us could be a Compagno della Causa. From this reproduction, I can't really tell his clothing, but it looks similar to one of the internet sources. And here's a picture of a Compagni della Causa that I found referenced on the internet. But then he's using that as a reference to near this person is the person with the robe. I had just recognized the cloak which Albertine had put on to come with me to Versailles in an open carriage on the evening which I so little suspected that scarcely 15 hours separated me from the moment of her departure from my house. Okay, so he recognizes a cloak. Now, when I look up the word cloak, it's interesting because a cloak is a robe, but it doesn't have sleeves. Sleeveless robe. That's important when we're going to try to identify it here. Now he's remembering the last time he saw Albertine, and they went to Versailles. Versailles is a French palace outside of Paris where the royalty built it and stayed there. Back to the text. Always ready for anything. When I had asked her to come with me on that melancholy evening, which she was to describe in her last letter as doubly crepuscular, in that dusk was falling and that we were about to part. Crepuscular, it means twilight. So it's doubly crepuscular because it was twilight, meaning the day was going to end and their relationship was going to end. So she flung over her shoulders a Fortuny cloak, which she had taken away with her the next day, and which I had never thought of since. So she flings over her shoulder a Fortuny cloak. And I think that this brown embroidered cloak is the cloak that Albertine was wearing. Now Fortuny was a artist around Proust's time, and he was also a fashion designer. And he thought that fashions keep reappearing throughout history. And so he looked at old paintings and he grabbed fashions from previous centuries and he reproduced them in his time, which was Proust's time. So Fortuny had looked at the Carpaccio and he had seen this embroidery on these noblemen. He thought, hey, I'll copy that in today's French society, and it was very popular with the upper society. Of course, this was a very, very expensive garment. She flung over her shoulders a Fortuny cloak, which she had taken away with her the next day, and which I had never thought of since. So then he continues, it was from this Carpaccio picture that the inspired son of Venice had taken it, inspired son of Venice, is Fortuny. It was from the soldiers of this Compagno della Calza that he had removed it in order to drape it over the shoulder of so many Parisian women who were certainly unaware, as I had been until then, that the model of it existed in a group of noblemen in the foreground of the Patriarch of Grado in a room at the Accademia in Venice. I had recognized it down to the last detail, and that cloak having restored to me as I looked at the eyes and the heart of him who had set out that evening with Albertine for Versailles, I was overcome for a few moments with a vague feeling of desire and melancholy. So then he's saying, I'm in Venice at the Accademia Museum. I was reminded of this event in the past. My current self looked to the heart of my past self, and I was overcome for a few moments by a vague feeling of desire and melancholy. But that is an exquisite example of how Proust writes. It's a pretty amazing sentence. Now, if you were to read this and not want to look up all this stuff like I just did, look at that, took us 20, 30 minutes. You might just read this and say, oh, he was in Venice, he saw a painting, it reminded of Albertine. Now, that's the general narrative that will carry you to the next sentence. But if you really want to dig deep into a Proust sentence, like I have just done, this is what happens. So you can understand why Proust is pretty difficult to read. I recommend it, but I understand completely if it's too difficult. Regarding some of the discrepancies that I mentioned regarding the Ponte Vecchio, there's another one where he says that Fortuny removed the robe from the Compagnie del Calza and put it on the Parisian women. That's not quite accurate. I wanted to clarify that Proust is writing from memory. The name of the book is Remembrance of Things Past. He wrote 3,000 pages of memory. He was filled with this memory, and he had to, and that's what he used to write the book. He remembers conversations, he remembers facial expressions, he remembers buildings, he remembers social situations, he remembers clothing, he remembers weather. I mean, it's astounding all the things he remembers. And so to expect some kind of accuracy when he's writing fiction, which is non-factual literature, is to hold him to a high level of accuracy. He's not writing journalism, he's not writing history, scientific papers. This is fiction, it's make-believe. So I want to avoid being the guy who points out errors in Proust. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it's difficult to read Proust, and maybe this is part of it, but it is worthwhile. We're going to read it one more time. Carpaccio, as it seems, who was the painter we visited most readily when I was not working in St. Mark's, almost succeeded one day in reviving my love of Albertine. I was seeing for the first time the Patriarch of Grado exercising a demonic. I looked at the marvelous rose pink and violet sky and the tall encrusted chimneys silhouetted against it, their flared stacks blossoming like red tulips, reminiscent of so many whistlers of Venice. Then my eyes traveled from the old wooden Rialto to that 15th century Ponte Vecchio with its marble palaces decorated with gilded capitals, and returned to the canal on which the boats are maneuvered by adolescents in pink jackets and plumed torques. Finally, before leaving the picture, my eyes came back to the shore, swarming with the everyday Venetian life of the period. I looked at the barber wiping his razor, at the Negro humping his barrel, at the Muslims conversing, at the noblemen in wide-sleeved brocade and damask robes and hats of cerise velvet, and suddenly I felt a slight gnawing at my heart. On the back of one of the Compagni della Calza, identifiable from the emblem embroidered in gold and pearls on their sleeves or their collars of the merry confraternity to which they were affiliate, I had just recognized the cloak which Albertine had put on to come with me to Versailles in an open carriage on the evening when I so little suspected that scarcely 15 hours separated me from the moment of her departure from my house. always ready for anything, when I had asked her to come out with me on that melancholy evening, which she was to describe in her last letter as doubly crepuscular in that dusk was falling and we were about to part, she had flung over her shoulders a Fortuny cloak, which she had taken away with her the next day, and which I had never thought of since. It was from this Carpaccio picture that inspired son of Venice had taken it. It was from the shoulders of this Compagno della Calza that he had removed it in order to drape it over the shoulder of so many Parisian women who were certainly unaware, as I had been until then, that the model for it existed in a group of noblemen in the foreground of the Patriarch of Grado in a room in the Accademia in Venice. I had recognized it down to the last detail, and that cloak, having restored to me, as I looked at it, the eyes and the heart of him who had set out that evening with Albertine for Versailles, I was overcome for a few moments by a vague feeling of desire and melancholy. When we go over all the details, which I have done, you can see that it just makes it so much more real and so much more exciting and beautiful, the way that he has added all these details to capture his melancholy state. So that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Reading Proust is one of the most memorable things I've done in my life. Thanks for watching.